Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This week, finally, the debate is turning towards how are we going to get back to work? How are we going to get back into our offices and factories? How are we going to get children back into schools? And indeed, how are we going to get back to travelling, even if it means that the destination is only New Zealand and the only tourists we'll ever see are from New Zealand? Will they become a seventh state? Maybe not quite yet, but we'll be looking at that as well. Later on in our Books and Culture segment, we've got some rippers for you today. We've got a very apposite book on the Spanish flu of 100 years ago. For those who are feeling like the lockdown is the end of the world, they'll enjoy hearing about Oscar Wilde's reflections on his time in Reading Jail, what it's like to be under a true lockdown, and I'll be talking about Winston Churchill just for something to do. Joining me today to talk about these and other momentous issues, I have first of all my co-host, Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University.
Good morning, Scott.
Great to have you, Chris. Also, of course, an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. And joining us today is Dara Macdonald, a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you back on the show, Dara. For those listening, don't forget this is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out how you can join or donate, please do go to ipa.org.au. But first up, Chris, how are we going to get back to work?
What a great question. I'm glad you asked. So Scott Morrison had a press conference yesterday, as you say, very explicitly turning the discussion on how we're going to get back to work. The key thing that I took away from that press conference is the scale of the challenge. So there are 1 million Australians out of work at the moment. There are an estimated 4 million Australians on JobKeeper subsidies. So that says to us that nearly 40% of the entire Australian workforce is either out of work or their work is being subsidised by the government. This is one of the reasons that the restrictions are costing us $4 billion a week. Morrison was touting some new guidelines released by Safe Work Australia about how to manage risks in the workplace. And at the moment, it does look like the strategy will be announce a grand reopening and just hope that private sector companies and non-profits actually return to work. I wonder how likely that is going to be, given once the government takes off the restrictions that they've imposed, or at least eases the restrictions, then it becomes on us. It becomes on us to manage our risks. It becomes on employers to decide what constitutes a safe workplace, subject, of course, to new regulations, no doubt. But I thought, Dara, you've got quite a background in working through some of these questions, obviously not pandemic-related questions, but questions about corporate law and those sorts of things. So I wonder what your takeaway was. How quickly are we going to get back to work, and how quickly do you think people will want to get back to work?
Well, it's a good question in the sense that we really don't know what the future holds in this respect, and it's definitely going to be, in the few months and even, a year or so into the future, it will be an ever-evolving policy space, and I'm sure that there'll be always new guidelines and so on being released, and you can see in Safe Work Australia that they've released new principles around how to manage your workplace, and it's divided into industries, but in the end they're just principles, and it's up to the state health and safety bodies that are currently regulating the space to actually make decisions, which leads to the question that there's probably going to be very different between different states as to what they implement and in terms of what regulations that businesses will have to follow. So it's going to be very much a state-by-state basis as to what comes in terms of being, the regulations that businesses are going to have to follow.
One of the things I want to explore, though, just before you go on, you've talked there about the health and safety regulations. And but of course, as someone who's been involved in corporate law, there are overlapping, and I've had a look at some of these guidelines. So there are health and safety guidelines, but then of course we operate inside the realm of employment law. We've also got health restrictions still on movement, soon to be lifted perhaps, but in terms of what we can require employees to be at work for as opposed to working from home, the health and safety guidelines are only one part of the picture, aren't they?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, the problem is there's going to be interlocking regulations and also interlocking bodies regulating the space, as in terms of, Fair Work Australia is now being given permission to arbitrate disputes between employees and employers under the JobKeeper, which will obviously extend into areas when they actually go back to work and whether their duties which they're asked to perform are in their remit. Of course, employers are technically able to give the employee directions and change their duties depending on what work is available, but it's also possible for the employee to dispute that and take it to the Fair Work Commission, thereby hamstringing the ability of the business to be able to react agilely to the evolving space and implement changes as they see fit. So it's not just like one area that is which is being changed. It's this interlocking regulation from the Fair Work Commission and the WHS regulation bodies in various states, and obviously the federal bodies, that are all going to be mishmashed together and create a very difficult space for employers to navigate going forward.
This intersects with something that we've been talking about a lot, Scott, on the podcast, which is the view that even if the government hadn't made hadn't enforced mandatory social distancing would have occurred regardless, and different companies and different individuals would have responded in order to protect their own health. And it's notable that the guidelines from the government, or at least the ruling from the government, certainly here in Victoria, has been always, if you can work from home, you must work from home. And different companies have had to make decisions about what can work from home actually looks like. Is there jobs? Are there jobs capable of being taken to telework environments, where those calculations aren't going to change in the new environment? Even if the state premiers and chief ministers announced tomorrow that we can all go back to work, there are a lot of companies that will decide that they don't want to take the risk. They don't want to take the risk from a health and safety perspective, from a legal perspective, and just from a pastoral care perspective. It's also the case that a lot of employees won't go back to work, even if their employer decides that it's safe to do so. And I guess the question is, and I know you've been looking at this, the question is, how will we be able to navigate those choices? Yes,
well, for employers in Australia, it's never been a particularly easy job anyway to navigate through the maze of regulations and red tape, and particularly those that come out of the industrial relations sense. But yes, as you say, it's all very well for the Prime Minister to say we should be back at work by July, and I mean, God bless him. But when the opinion poll suggests that the Australian population is roughly divided down the middle as to whether or not we should, and certainly social media seems to be full of people who are just hiding under their blankets and feel like the country should, for the rest of eternity as well, they can vote with their feet. So an employer, the scenario that interests me is an employer can say, rightio, we're reopening the office with appropriate health and safety management plan and social distancing and disinfection guidelines and so on. And the employee will simply say, I do not consider it a safe workplace to return to. And also, I believe I can work from home. And if the employer says, well, on what basis do you think you can work from home? The employee will say, well, I've been doing it for the last 8 weeks. So these are the sort of disputes that Dara were referring to. Katrina Grace Kelly had a great article in The Australian on Saturday about disputes which are already arising under the aegis of the JobKeeper scheme, and I would expect to see many more.
Yeah, particularly this is the realm of the WHS bodies on state levels to arbitrate such disputes where the employee says this is not a safe work environment and the employer says no, it is. This is another dispute that would end up in a bureaucratic arbitration.
I guess there's something that we should start trying to understand, which is that regardless of how much the government has responded at the policy level, that the private sector and communities are going to respond and make their own risk assessments about the danger of the pandemic themselves, regardless of what governments do. And we've always said this. This is what we're seeing in Sweden, for instance, where there's advice rather than mandatory guidelines about social distancing. And social distancing has occurred as we try to kick the economy up again, as we try to return to prosperity. Those are precisely the same calculations that people are going to be made. It turns the onus back onto us. In fact, we've been having this conversation just I know a lot of conversations have been having in families. So if it is the case that you're allowed to go and see your family members, socialise with your family members in New South Wales, it's now 2 people it can come into someone else's home plus children. In Western Australia, it's gatherings of 10 and so forth. All that does is put the onus back on families themselves. And as we come into Mother's Day, I think a lot of families around the country are having conversations about, we'd like to see you, we're legally allowed to see you, but maybe it's not in our best interest, or maybe we have different risk perceptions and so forth. I think it just gets more complicated from here. Whereas previously the private sector could rely on, it's against the law for us to go into work. Now these things have to be socially negotiated.
And that's partly where this, I think, what Morrison does understand is it is partly the leadership of the national cabinet and the role of politicians to create that momentum. And I just want to amplify, by the way, this is a bit, if you'll allow a digression. Go
to town.
That wretched Imperial College modelling that has been such a disservice to the UK. One of the things it did is said you couldn't possibly follow Sweden because here's this modelling about how disastrous it would be, and that translated into figures of about 25,000 projected deaths from COVID-19. Fraser Nelson in The Spectator has pulled this apart. And how was that modelling done? Well, they assumed that in the absence of government restrictions of the kind that we've seen in the UK and New Zealand and to a large extent in Australia, there would be no social distancing. The idea that humans are incapable of forming their own judgments was actually hardwired into the Imperial College modelling. And of course, the number of deaths in Sweden, it's not insignificant, but it's like an order of magnitude. It's a tenth of what those projections would have implied. And these are the sort of idiocies we've seen. And it does put the onus back on it. And as I say, I'm concerned about the significant number of Australians who don't seem to want that freedom, who just would find it easier for the government to keep us all in lockdown and remove the need to actually engage with that problem.
It's an interesting framing, isn't it? And it's the framing of the state, to be all libertarian about it. And I've been thinking about, so I'll talk in a moment about the Spanish flu, but in New South Wales, at least, during the Spanish flu in 1919 for Australia, face masks were made compulsory. Now, the reason that face masks have been such a political dispute during this crisis is because the government decided that there weren't enough face masks. They had to import lots of face masks, so they told us not to wear face masks and leave them for the medical workers. Now, so it's become this big policy question about, well, how will the government be able to provide us with all the face masks if we were all to either adopt them or even make it mandatory. Now, in 1919, there wasn't a official government face mask policy. There wasn't a national czar of acquiring face masks. We just all made them ourselves. The private sector, per se, responded. We all made those calculations. We all figured out how to adhere to the new restrictions, and we tried to go about our business. And I think so much of the discussion in March was about, well, if the government doesn't do this, then there will be no private sector response. The people won't understand, and we'll all, like sheep, just receive. We'll all just get COVID. In fact, I think what's going to happen now over the next few months is we're going to see what the nature of that private sector response is, given uncertain risks about the disease.
I would say that's already happened. If you look at lots of the private producers of face masks already stepping into gear. I mean, I know Scott's children have been making face masks, and I've seen lots of my friends on Facebook have been making face masks in their spare time. But even alcohol producers.
I just want to drill down on that, Scott. Have your children been making face masks?
Absolutely. My 15-year-old has a nice little side hustle going. In fact, I will go and find one in a moment so that I can demonstrate what she's managed to do.
Awesome. Sorry, Dara.
I was just saying that also alcohol producing companies, and my mum, who also has a small business, who had a whole bunch of food grade alcohol, has started producing hand sanitizer as well, and has been making a bit of a killing, having a side hustle, making hand sanitizer, purely because people had already, before the lockdown, started taking precautions to protect themselves in terms of face masks and hand sanitizer, and all these sorts of things that people often went out and bought on their own own
absolutely
common sense, rather than having to wait for the government to tell them what to do in terms of keeping themselves safe.
Still on this theme, I would also observe, I think any listener who has actually stuck their head out the front door and gone about their business or gone to get a coffee would have noticed that I think in the last week there are more and more people out and about. Notwithstanding the guidelines, they weren't necessarily waiting for governments to relax the restrictions. I've been meaning to find these charts where people track the number of traffic movements in cities, but I believe it went from something like 95% of a benchmark to about 25%, and now it's back up to about 40 or 50. I mean, people are making decisions, and of course the best kind of government leadership is simply to note what people are doing and then to claim credit for doing it. So there's a bit of that going on.
Yeah, and I think people are reading the same data that we're reading. We're looking at the number of infections there are, and we're responding regardless of government policy.
Yeah, I'm full of digressions today. If you'll allow me to frame this debate about health and safety, this will be the continuing challenge of the national leadership, because an approach to health and safety, it does not mean zero incidents, zero cases. And again, Morrison, I think, has been quite articulate on this, that it's about what you do when cases are identified. And there's a wonderful example of this in Cedar Meats in Melbourne, where there has been an outbreak due to one employee. A case in early April. They didn't realise it was connected to the workplace, and it does turn out to have been a cluster. But the penny dropped when they realised that something was happening in the workplace was they did a blood test on an employee who'd been admitted to hospital having severed his thumb. This is obviously some poor bastard working in the boning room. And I guess the point is, health and safety risks always need to be seen in the context of all of the risks in which society operates. And if you're an employee working in the boning room, it may well be that COVID-19 is not necessarily the greatest risk that you've actually got to deal with.
Yeah, that's right. And we have to, each company is going to have to do some very careful management of those risks. But more importantly, they're going to have to do a lot of really careful communication of the management of those risks. And that's a company by company thing. That is not a federal government or state government thing.
Yes, that's right. One employee coming down with COVID-19 does not mean the policy has failed. They've been clear also, the guidelines, that does not mean you need to shut down your workplace.
No, there's another point, and I watched the Scott Morrison conference very closely, and it really struck me how he was strongly emphasizing that the government is not pursuing an elimination strategy. So they want to be really clear that we are not planning to eliminate COVID-19 in Australia. Now, I'm not sure how much I believe that, just looking at the numbers and the way the governments have way different governments have responded. But if that is the case, our numbers are so low that it becomes we return to the original strategy, which is we're all eventually going to get it. We're all, or at least 70% of Australians are eventually going to get it. And our healthcare system is now up to scratch and capable of dealing with large quantities of people with an infectious disease.
Indeed, we've shifted. We've both flattened the curve and lifted the capacity of the healthcare system to manage it. So even though organisations like the Grattan Institute have been, promoting this eradication strategy, the government's not buying it. Other than, of course, the Victorian government, which officially, or at least on a de facto basis, does seem to be operating on an eradication methodology. We saw Daniel Andrews this week as part of what's become the dispute over whether or not to reopen the schools, decided to tweet about an individual case, which is a teacher employed at a school in the northeastern suburbs of Melbourne, who was diagnosed. The school was closed for cleaning, and the Premier was tweeting about this as if this proved his point somewhat about how unsafe it would be to open schools. The fact that said teacher had not actually been in a classroom teaching students at any time and had been practicing social distancing when he did attend the site was completely lost.
That's right, Scott. So let's talk about the schools for a moment. I'm sorry, I'll throw to you, Dara, in a sec. So right now, the situation is as follows. Western Australian and South Australian students are back at school. There is some attendance issues, but by and large, they are back at school. New South Wales and Queensland students are planned to return partially to school from next week. But Victoria is in a position, Victoria's policy at the moment, and we're recording on Wednesday, is that they will only return in term 3, which term 3 in Victoria is the 13th of July. There's been a huge dispute between Victoria and the Commonwealth Government that led to some verbal insults and apologies between Dan Tehan, the Education Minister at the Commonwealth level, and Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews. Of course, the Commonwealth originally opposed school closures in March, but Victoria forced its hand, and now Tehan is trying to tie funding of independent schools to opening. Anyway, it is a absolute political schmozzle, which is obviously why the Victorian Premier is focusing on things like individual cases. But Dara, you've been looking at quite some detail about at least just the transmission and the risks of school reopening, haven't you?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely telling when you look at there's actually been commissioned studies that Australia has commissioned, particularly the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance commissioned a study of schools in New South Wales, of particularly these are schools that had been exposed to COVID-19, and of the 863 staff and students that were exposed to COVID-19, only 2 had antibodies to COVID-19. So this is not even a question of that the children aren't getting severe symptoms. They're also not transmitting the disease in the same way as you would expect. If you're a parent, obviously, you know that children can be a little germ carriers that bring the flu and so on home from school. But it seems that from not just this study, but studies around the world as well, that children are not actually transmitting the disease. So it begs the question as to why this has become such a political football when the evidence is actually so clearly on the side that school closures are both ineffective in terms of preventing transmission, but also in terms of their side effects, in terms of being, the parents not being able to send their kids to school obviously has effects on their ability to do their work. And then on top of that, obviously, it affects kids and their ability to access education if they're not able to go to school. So, I mean, it has such...
Certainly. Sorry, Dara, but just to put it in context, that is a fascinating study, and another example perhaps of where it's like the old gag about well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? No one really knows why this is the case with children, why they respond in this way to the virus. But as you say, the evidence from studies appears to be highly consistent around the world. But Morrison went out of his way yesterday to highlight the economic impact of school closures. I think it was something like 3% of the job losses were attributable to the closure of schools. Chris, you might have the numbers at your fingertips, but we're not allowed to weigh up the health risk versus the economic and social impacts. But God, somebody has to. And,
it is super interesting. I think that, and it's been really, it's brought home to a lot of people how fundamental schools are from a national productivity perspective. You've got your children doing household production, which is great, and sounds like you're going to make a stack of cash out of that, Scott. So good for you. Unfortunately, my children have not been making masks, and I've got a prep and a year 3, and homeschooling or distance education, as it is more strictly, is just really, really burdensome on the family. And when we think about, and we've managed to handle it reasonably well, and my wife is obviously at home as well. She's in a position that she can work from home. But if we take our personal experience of the productivity loss due to the fact that we have to simultaneously work and homeschool our children, and if you extrapolate that over the 30% or 40% of the Australian economy that is at work, and not all of them have kids, then the productivity hit to the economy is extraordinary. And that has obviously been the big focus of the Commonwealth for since the start of this. Josh Frydenberg has talked a lot about the productivity consequence of closing the schools. But I think it is extraordinary, and I think we're starting to understand how fundamental those family relationships are to national productivity. If we don't get back to work, if we don't send the kids back, then we're going to have some really long-term hits. This is just not a sustainable model.
So, Dara, how will the schools operate under the regimes that the government's talking about, or at least the federal government? Well, I should rephrase that. How are schools operating in states like South Australia and Western Australia, where this is already happening?
Well, I think in generally there's been a huge drop-off on attendance in schools. I think for most states there's been a 20% like a 20% rate of actual school attendances. Most people have actually pulled their kids out of school. So I think that's an indicator of what the social position as opposed to the legal position is. And in terms of there really isn't any need to create social distancing. Even if you could create social distancing at schools, I think that would be totally improbable. But even if that was the case, that you could create social distancing, the evidence suggests that you don't actually need it. So I think this is one of those situations where the community is maybe a little bit behind what is actually the risk in this respect, and the fact that lots of people have pulled their kids out of school is an indication of people's being spooked basically by COVID-19. And there could be a bit more messaging as to how safe it is to send your kids to school, as opposed to having a quite a spooky
that's right.
News story.
So that's quite right about the I guess the customer response, and then also there's been the role that the education unions have played in the different states, particularly the Labor states opposing the reopening. And the gag in Victoria is that the construction unions wanted the construction industry to remain open, so it did, and the education unions want the schools to remain closed, so they will. And there's a bit of a pincer movement, but at least with, I guess, the public response, if you can reopen the schools, we'll see that attendance record change over time.
Yeah.
And people can make their own choices, and I think eventually you'll get to that critical mass.
And one of the reasons that they did close the schools, as I understand in Victoria at least, was there was really precipitous drop-off in attendance in the week before. So we know from our child's school that there was something like 20% of people were keeping the kids home anyway. Now, that was facilitated by the fact that a lot of private sector employers had told their workers to go home as well. But there was a time when we all just made the decision to shelter in place, if you will.
Yeah, and I wonder if these restrictions will also have wide-ranging consequences, as with changes to the workplace. So we'll probably, thankfully, see a decline in hot desking and all these sorts of crazy activities. I say that as someone who worked for an IT company for a little while. Whether it will also have a commensurate effect on education, and whether stuff like compulsory education and dissuading people from homeschooling would have an impact here, in the sense that maybe more people will not have Chris's experience, but would actually, after this, would like to homeschool their kid a bit more, or engage in these sorts of practices.
Yeah, that's right. No, you're quite right. Putting on my editor of the IPA review hat, I do have an article in the forthcoming edition, which any member of the IPA will receive in their mailbox in a week or two, on the merits of homeschooling, written by someone who's actually done it with her children. And I emailed a proof copy to her just yesterday, and I said, well done, you've already created a movement that's led to about 4 million children being educated at home. So how's that for impact? We haven't even published it yet.
A lot of people are enjoying this. So a lot of families have had the opportunity to spend more time understanding what their kids are learning, understanding how to communicate that learning better to their children as well. And I know that a lot of families have been able to dedicate that sort of time. The feedback that we get from the teachers has been that a lot of families are actually asking for more content, because they want to spend more time teaching their kids. I suspect that for the families that can do so, this will be a semi-permanent change, and people will be much more comfortable, to the extent that the legal system allows them to, much more comfortable taking some responsibility for their child's education.
The socio-economic divide, I suspect, of those who can afford to do it, who can afford to have one of the parents dedicated to the task, and as opposed to those where the parents need to work, essentially.
Yeah,
and the technology divide as well. There are some real issues with some children at schools about they've only got one device in the house, but they've got multiple children. So how do you use one iPad to do 3 classes of work? And so hugely different. I know that certainly in Victoria, a lot of people have been allowed, or some people have been allowed into the schools if they don't have the sort of support that they need at home. But yeah, you really interesting challenges there.
Yeah, I think your point is very good, in terms of that it is definitely a divide, and obviously having more time with your family is dependent on how great your family is, and there's lots of people that maybe are in very difficult circumstances at home, as opposed to having a cushy time, spending time with their fantastic family. So yeah, I think there's definitely, there needs to be options for both circumstances, and to have this kind of blanket ban that you can't send your kids to school versus you have to send your kids to school, in the sense of, previously it was very much frowned upon if you took your kids out of school to homeschool them. Hopefully the effect of this is that both choices become acceptable.
And maybe we'll finish up with a situation more like America, where the homeschooling movement is not only huge, it's actually become a powerful lobby in its own right. Maybe the the education unions will actually begin to regret the enthusiasm with which they invited Australians to homeschool their children, and how long they asked them to do it for. Speaking of family, we all love it when our cousins come to visit. So one of the most interesting things that's happened this week is the invitation to Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, to join the National Cabinet, which is the state and federal leaders of Australia, to discuss cooperation, including possible travel between these two islands in the South Seas, which are remarkably free of coronavirus from a global perspective, and how they might cooperate in future. Chris, is there some deeper significance to this?
Yeah, just one correction, 4 islands, if you think about that. So you're right, Jacinda Ardern joined the National Cabinet for 2 reasons. She was briefing the premiers and chief ministers about their policy responses. Of course, New Zealand has had a much more extensive restrictions and, in my view, somewhat absurd restrictions on things like banning takeaway food and all that sort of thing, but they're starting to ease those because they're at zero or near zero. And more importantly and more interestingly is this idea that there might be a travel bubble with New Zealand in coming months, not weeks, as the Prime Minister pointed out. I think there's 2 things to talk about. First of all, the significance of having the New Zealand Prime Minister actually on a Australian public policy discussion forum, which apparently hasn't happened since the Second World War, as our Prime Minister reported. The special relationship between New Zealand and Australia, to the extent that we are both remarkable successes in tackling COVID-19, I would expect just keeps expanding. What we're seeing already is a much closer policy union, and I suspect that as this goes on, if the COVID-19, if our bubble continues as it is and our success relative to the rest of the world continues, I think that we're going to see a great expansion of that political and policy relationship with potentially long-term consequences.
There's certainly a long backstory to this relationship. It was we go back to 1890 when the New Zealand sent some delegates to the original Federation conference, and in the end, of course, they said that they weren't particularly interested in joining with the Australian Federation. The circumstances were too different. The climate was too different. One of the representatives made some reference to the fact that the Europeans who had immigrated into New Zealand were of a different character to those who had come into Australia, which presumably was a none too subtle reference to the convict stain on
the fact that we're all criminals. Yeah,
that's right.
It's a fair comment, you have to say.
Yeah, that's right. And who can blame them? And they were fresh from their the resolution to the Maori Wars. And the last thing they wanted was some Australians blundering into that relationship and stuffing that up. So they were never particularly interested, but certainly there was a lot of thought on the Australian side that it could happen. If there's a reason why we have a suburb in Canberra called Manuka in honour of New Zealand. We have a Canberra Avenue that was originally slated to be Wellington Avenue when the city was laid out as early as, I think it was 1913. So there was always an Australian dream that somehow we could convince our Kiwi cousins to get involved. But of course, they're not stupid. They look at the way our federation actually works, and they've had remarkably and understandably very little interest in actually doing so.
But so I don't think that it's fun to imagine there would be a 7th state, which if you look at population numbers would make it a minor state in the Australian Federation. So that's not very attractive from the New Zealand perspective. But it is very plausible. And I think as long as our bubble functions as a bubble, as long as it's unlikely that we open to the rest of the world in coming months or even up to 18 months or so, it's very likely that we just get much more policy integration. So the second part of the conversation at the National Cabinet, where it's reported to be about this idea of the travel bubble, that yes, we're going to probably keep our doors closed to tourists and business travel for quite some time, probably well into 2021. But given the consistency that both New Zealand and Australia have tackled the virus, we probably can open much sooner. Now, when I first heard of this, I thought, okay, great. The next family holiday is to New Zealand. But we have a very close immigration relationship with New Zealand already. We have basically open borders from a migration perspective. And this takes that model and says, okay, well, open borders between Australia and New Zealand, but closed borders with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think it's going to be increasing political union per se, but we have had a very significant relationship in terms of travel, in terms of migration between New Zealand and Australia. I would say that it was actually in previous times easier to travel between Australia and New Zealand than there was, passport-free travel, which we don't have at the moment. But it is still probably the a close connection in terms of travel and business relationships, and also emigration for a longer term. So yeah, I think this is mainly just returning to some normalcy with New Zealand, as opposed to a gigantic leap or a closer union per se. I think it's just an attempt to return to normalcy in one aspect of our relationship with them.
I always think the New Zealand relationship is worth reflecting on, because it shows how things can work. The original Closer Economic Relations Agreement that was initiated by the Fraser government under the leadership of Doug Anthony, the Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the National Parties, is one of the great such instruments anywhere in the world in terms of the level of practical economic cooperation that can be achieved without having to do political union. And it really gives the lie to everything that the European Union tries to do, because it shows that you can have closer economic relations without always having to have ever closer union. And I recall when there was a point when the Kiwis were doing very well and we were doing rubbish, and our respective currencies were approaching parity. And some, let's call them idiots, were saying, well, wouldn't this be a great opportunity to have a currency union? Which would, of course, replicated all of the problems that the euro has. For
even less benefit.
For even less benefit. As we discussed on a recent podcast, it's the currency union that's been driving the need for political integration in Europe, which is deliberate. It makes no sense economically. So I just think the relationship that we have with New Zealand is terrific, because it is about economic relations. We don't worry too much about the politics, and if they join in a body like the National Cabinet on a very loose, informal basis, I think that's all upside without any of the downside.
I would also add to that in the sense that the trans-Tasman partnership, or the relationship that Australia and New Zealand has in terms of travel, was a document that was used to draft the Kanzuk agreements, which is the travel between the former colonies, basically the England, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, which was a possible policy solution when the UK left the EU, as to creating a union which wasn't based on politics, but it was actually based on the ability to move around in order to have economic and social gains, which comes with freedom of movement. So I would put that in the policy square as well, that our agreement with New Zealand has actually been a representation of what is possible in terms of integrating with the world in a way that doesn't actually form a political union.
Yeah, no, a great model. And Chris, something we were talking about earlier, which I'll bring in, it was going to be at the top of the show, but I'll bring it in here, of course. One of the other relations we have with New Zealand is New Zealand has a team in the NRL, And it's been remarkable, actually. How's this for cooperation? We had a flight direct from Wellington into Tamworth, which is not even an international airport. Border Force granted an exemption for the Warriors to fly into Tamworth so they could begin training. We have Melbourne Storm had to get on a bus and go to New South Wales, go to Albury so they could train because they weren't allowed to in Victoria. And the Warriors were allowed into Australia. The NRL is doing remarkable things by basically ignoring all the polite ways of operating, and they are storming ahead with apparently, which is the leadership style of the chairman and as executive chairman, essentially, Peter V'landys, to get the NRL operating by May. And it's just, I found it a fascinating story to watch because it's it shows that in order to get businesses operating, it's not, it will require a push. The NRL and AFL, they actually need to push. If they're just waiting for governments to deliver a solution on a plate, it won't happen.
And that's right. And so what is remarkable about this is our policy discussion usually is very reserved. We sit back and we think about policy proposals. We think about tax reform, and they put out big tax documents and changes to superannuation. And policy takes time, and it's usually instigated by policymakers. In this case, and I think both to the specific question of what our policy integration is going to be with New Zealand and the way that we open up, things are just going to run at the policymakers because businesses have to make choices, and businesses will be looking to identify the barrier that prevents them from getting back to work or bringing their employees back to the office or what have you. And it's going to be thrown up to the policymakers for basically up-down votes on, well, will you accept it or won't you accept it? And that's precisely what the NRL has done. They just, okay, well, we'll get the permission from Border Force and we'll make the decisions ourselves. Unlike almost any time in Australian history in the last 50 years at least, things are just going to rush into policy change, and that's kind of exciting, but from a political perspective, really, really threatening to the authority of our policymakers, I think.
Yeah, for a control freak like Morrison, so he was directly asked. He said, according to the chairman of the NRL, the Warriors have been given permission to land at Tamworth, and he said, no, they haven't. That's not true. And he was asked again,
and yet they landed.
And yet, as if by magic, the permit was granted and they were able to land. So Morrison loves to be a control freak, but yes, maybe you're right, Chris, that this will be a sign of things to come, where people need to muscle up a little bit and actually take control of their destinies.
Australian public policy for the next few months is going to be very much forgiveness rather than permission, I think.
I hope so. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere.
No.
We have come to that part of the show where we talk about our picks for books and culture, what we've been reading, watching, and listening to. Chris, you've got a book which I'll just introduce. It's about the Spanish flu. I just wanted to share a little story I read about via social media, but it was originally in the New York Times. A gentleman sadly passed away with COVID-19. He was 100 years old. And all deaths are a tragedy, but at 100 is a fair innings. But what made this a newsworthy story for the New York Times was he was one of twins, and his twin brother had died during the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu and COVID-19 100 years apart. It was a good yarn.
That is extraordinary. So the book that I have been reading is by John Barry. It's called The Great Influenza. It's the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. Obviously, it's about the 1918-1919 Spanish flu. The book was published in 2005. It's a very interesting book. It's there's a lot of tangential knowledge about the development of the American medical medical research particularly, that really grew up in the shadow and in and amongst the Spanish flu pandemic. But I've got two really significant takeaways from this book. And of course, when we read it, we're reading it precisely in line with these days drawing relationships between what we're experiencing right now. The big thing is that the Spanish flu was absolutely brutal. It had not everybody died from it by any stretch of the imagination, but it had a much more significant fatality rate than even the largest estimates of COVID-19 when they were made back in February and March. But it was just a really virulent, it was a really rapid onset disease, and there was very little that they could do about the Spanish flu if you received it. You just had to hope that you didn't get very severe pneumonia, because that was probably a death sentence for most people who received it. So a really brutal disease, and interesting to think about, because of course these days we look back at the experience of the Spanish flu and try to take those lessons to be applied to our experience right now. I know in my field, economics, a lot of economists are looking at how different cities managed the Spanish flu, how different companies and countries managed the Spanish flu. It's not totally clear to me, given the vastly different characteristics of the Spanish flu and our current pandemic, that those lessons are very applicable. So that's the first big takeaway. The second takeaway is not so significant, but it was really interesting. So the Spanish flu was distributed unevenly across the world. It comes to different countries at different times, but it came to most countries during the First World War. And that's why we call it the Spanish flu, because censorship prevented us from describing it as probably where it came from, which was either Kansas or Texas in the United. Well, almost certainly it was an American, or it came from the United States. But Australia, it arrived in Australia in 1919. So after the end of the war and after press censorship had been largely abolished. So much of what we know about the global social reaction to the Spanish flu, we actually know because Australians were publishing about it. And if you read the newspapers, the book goes into some detail about how newspapers in Australia reported it. It was reported in much more terrifying ways than anything COVID is. So it was clearly, as they described it, a plague. It was a killer. It was the return of the Black Death. It was a really horrifying disease, and it must have been just extraordinary to live through those times. I think the big thing that I take away from this book is, wow, we've gotten we're lucky. We are lucky that we didn't have something as brutal as the Spanish flu, but we also have to bear that in mind when we think about the lessons from history.
Yes, that modelling you referred to, I have seen some of that, Chris. Have you seen the paper that's circulating on the web, The Hammer and the Dance, which relies on a lot of analysis of different state and cities in America and how they responded? It's the one that has the famous story about, I think it was Philadelphia. Yeah. They decided that there was far too much negativity around it and they should hold a parade to boost morale. And, of course, as soon as they had the parade, everybody got the Spanish flu and died. And this is seen to be as an argument for lockdown per se.
Well, that's right, but it's very useful to look at the lessons of history, and it's very useful to understand better about how the Spanish flu played out. But given that our policy environment, our scientific environment, and the characteristics of the disease are so different, I think it doesn't it doesn't give us an excuse not to reason through the policy choices. We can't just look at what happened in 1918-19 and say, well, they did this was successful then, this was a failure then, and blindly apply that. And I worry that a lot of particularly the academic discussion has been using those prior models as guidance for policy today.
Absolutely. Now, also reflecting on experience Dara, has been your selection today. Tell us about that.
Well, I've been reading a lot of pieces that were composed in solitude, and I'm holding up The Wit of Oscar Wilde because it's more aesthetically pleasing than my Kindle. And what I've read out of it was De Profundis, which is the letter that Oscar Wilde sent to his lover, or former lover, from prison, so Lord Alfred Douglas. And it strikes one as, first of all, you can count yourself as lucky that you're not in Reading jail in the turn of the century. So that's
in the 19th century.
Yes. So that's makes you feel much better that you're stuck in your house as opposed to a jail. The other thing is that it particularly highlights some of the character traits or character flaws that can appear if you're stuck wondering about different things or ruminating about different things, if you're stuck at home alone, or in this case in prison. And he really, despite the fact that the first half of the letter is really going over all the mistakes that were made he blames himself, but at the same time he exhibits a bit of bitterness towards Lord Alfred Douglas, and all the mistakes that were made during their relationship. And it was a very obviously we're going on his account of their relationship, but I will talk about Lord Alfred Douglas in a second. But we're going on his account of the relationship, and that it was very turbulent. But towards the middle of and towards the end of the letter, he starts talking about the issues that come with bitterness, and that bitterness really blinds people, and that ruminating in such a way and not counting. Ruminating is actually not very useful, and holding on to different situations is not very useful. And it's really, I think, was a cathartic letter towards the end, as opposed to trying to relay all his grievances about what happened with Lord Alfred Douglas. And I think lots of people have noted that the two most important lines is the start, where he says he addresses it to Dear Bosie, and at the last sentence he signs off as your affectionate friend, Oscar Wilde. So towards the end, he's really almost let go of the situation in a sense. So it is an interesting piece of literature. Interestingly enough, the biography of Lord Alfred Douglas was the first book that Douglas Murray wrote, and he tells the story of Lord Alfred Douglas in the wake of Oscar Wilde, and that he himself ended up in prison at the behest of Churchill himself after being sued for defamation, and also wrote what was meant to be a cathartic poem or prose, but it was also turned into a sort of sour, bitter expose of personality.
Sorry, Bosie also finished up in prison.
Yes, he did. He was sued by Churchill, interestingly, after saying that he was conspiring with Jewish finance. So Churchill sued him, and he ended up in prison.
So both Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas launched defamation actions, which actually resulted in them finishing up in prison.
Yes.
Yeah, well, there you go. There's a lesson for anyone thinking of launching a defamation action.
This only builds my contempt for defamation law, but go on.
Yes, obviously before the age of uniform defamation law. No, I think it's a terrific choice, Dara. And Oscar Wilde, the great Irish writer, it's an argument for suffering, I guess, in terms of art. I mean, he was clearly a brilliant wit and writer, but he'd made his reputation for being lively and gay in one sense of the word, and then of course with the scandal and being discovered to be gay in the other sense of the word. But the transformation that his years in Reading Jail wrought upon him, he came out and produced some remarkable works like the Ballad of Reading Jail and and the one that you've just referred to.
Yeah, and I think it also changes his personality or his writing as well. And he's known as quite a flippant and unserious character throughout most of his work. And there's a tale of him when he's visiting America, and he visits many prisons when he goes there, and and he makes some quip about the literature that they're reading in jail. Even if they're innocent, they still deserve to be hung because they're reading such atrocious literature. And then you see that like 100%, 180 turnaround when he ends up in prison himself, and it becomes a very much a champion of rights of prisoners in the end when he is released. So.
We'll pass this on to Andrew Bushnell for the IPA's Criminal Justice Project, which looks at punishment reform and more sensible sentencing and focusing on those violent offenders rather than people like Oscar Wilde who really had no good reason to be in prison in the first place. Great, and thank you, Dara, for setting it up for me too by introducing Churchill. In lockdown, I've had many an occasion just to sort of gaze idly at my bookcases, and I realised that years ago when I was accumulating the paperback volumes of the official history or the official biography of Winston Churchill, which was started by his son Randolph and then later finished by Sir Martin Gilbert, that I had 7 of the 8 volumes. I'd only ever picked up the paperbacks in bookstores as I found them, and I remember that there is this thing called the internet, and you can actually go and order them. So
it's the only life we have these days. So
it's the only life we have. So I am actually holding up a copy of Volume 2, which was Young Statesman, Winston S. Churchill, 1901 to 1914. Reminds you what a just incredibly ridiculously long public life this guy had. So that was the last of the volumes that Randolph Churchill wrote before they handed over the task to Martin Gilbert. And I read the other volumes back when the sort of before I was married and had time to read 7 volumes of an official biography. But this one is actually an important one to read because it covers the period when Churchill leapt from the Conservative Party to the Liberal Party, and to his detractors, this was always seen as just a sign of what an opportunist he was. A young man in a hurry, just doing whatever it took to advance his position. It certainly, in retrospect, was incredibly well timed. He jumped ship just as the Conservatives were going out and the Liberals were coming in, and he had a long period in the ministry and in the cabinet as a result. But what I think is relevant for the Looking Forward podcast is that the issue on which he split was actually free trade. So I don't accept that this was simply opportunistic. And he was in the Conservative Party, not necessarily happily in the Conservative Party. He was not a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, but he was happy enough. But this was at the age when Joseph Chamberlain started to introduce the notions of protectionism, of imperial preference. It was bound up with increasing taxation, but supposedly allowing discounts for colonies in the British Empire, which is, the foundation of imperial preference. And Churchill genuinely argued against this, and I say genuinely because he was taking risks to do so. He became part of a ginger group of backbench MPs, and then ultimately left, gave up his seat in Oldham, had to go and contest a different seat for the Liberals in Manchester, and made some terrific speeches on free trade that were then bound into a book. He talks, and some of the arguments I think are worth reflecting on because free trade is coming under attack again. Globalisation is coming under attack again, and there are genuine issues with, China. But he sees it all in terms of geopolitics, and he basically says, nations who are trading are less likely to go to war. He didn't want the British Empire to resemble a medieval town that would be walled off from the surrounding country, victualled for a siege, and containing within the circle of its battlements all that is necessary for war. So he saw free trade as inseparable from a global peace. And I think to those who say, well, he saw the light when he came back to the Conservatives in the 30s and accepted imperial preference, I would just say it was probably a done deal by then, and the world was hurtling towards war, and he essentially given up that fight that he tried to fight as a liberal, in 1905, 1906. It just reminds me what a not just a great leader, but what a truly interesting thinker, an effective politician and orator Churchill was. Some of the, as a result of the speeches he gave in Manchester, a town that had been solidly conservative became solidly liberal at the 1906 election. So I'm sure I think there is an abridged version by Martin Gilbert, or you could read the Anthony Roberts biography that we interviewed. Roberts, of course, Chris, on a Looking Forward episode last year. So there are other biographies of Churchill around, but it's good to dive into the detail on one and just see how issues like free trade and, there's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun, and that's a super interesting. I'm going to try to pick up that book of speeches actually by Churchill, because he's leaning on a traditional British argument for free trade that goes back to Richard Cobden and John Bright in the fight against the Corn Laws, which is what we now describe as commercial peace theory, which is that nations that trade together are much less likely to go to war with each other. This is an empirical question, of course, and it's been I actually think there's a lot to this argument, but it has to be adopted based on more recent empirical work. But it's a really traditional and sometimes forgotten argument for free trade, that countries, it's actually better understood the other way around. Countries that battle each other on protectionism are actually more likely to find themselves are moving into battles of war and violence.
Yes, rival trading systems and those great radical leaders, Cobden and Bright, Churchill were from, one or both of them was from Manchester, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but he pays due homage to them in those speeches, so I think you'll find it a very interesting volume, and I'll send you a couple of little links that I found as I was reflecting on all this.
And Victorians, of course, if they want to, when they're allowed to drive places, can go visit the towns of Cobden and Bright to acknowledge our wonderful free trade history in this country.
Yes, even though Victoria became and still remains the most protectionist state in the Federation.
Yes, but we can have Zach Gorman on to complain about that.
Yes, and we will in due course. You have been listening to the Books and Culture segment. You have been listening to Looking Forward, which is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. Please do join or donate at ipa.org.au to see how you can get around our research and access other great digital products and podcasts. You can track down the interview with Dave Rubin that our colleagues Pete and James did on the IPA podcast. You can look at the new Generation Liberty podcast, Viral Banter, how's that for a pun, and all sorts of great things like that. You've been listening to me, Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review. A big thank you to my co-host, Chris Berg, and to today's guest panellist, Dara Macdonald.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Thank you for everything, Dara. Thank you also to Josh in the remote control room for pulling together this episode. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.